The ruins of Sanctuary Prime floated silently in the darkness of space like a broken monument to a war that should never have happened. Lieutenant Jake Morrison stood at the observation deck of the transport shuttle and watched the debris drift past the window. 3 months had passed since the final battle, but the scars remained everywhere he looked. Jake was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. The war against the Crythian Empire had lasted 5 brutal years, and humanity had survived by pure stubborn refusal to surrender. The aliens had better weapons and faster ships, but humans had something the Crythians did not understand. They had the will to keep fighting even when logic said they should quit. The shuttle pilot called back to him that they were approaching the landing zone. Jake nodded and adjusted his uniform. He had received orders to report to the estate of General Victor Kane, and that alone made him nervous. The general had been his commanding officer during the war, and one of the few people Jake truly respected. But General Kane was dead now, and Jake could not imagine why the man would have any reason to include him in his will. The estate was located on a small moon that orbited a gas giant in neutral space. It was beautiful in a cold sort of way, with ice crystals that caught the light from the distant sun. The shuttle landed on a platform outside a large building that looked like it had been built long before the war. Jake stepped out into the thin atmosphere and felt the cold bite through his jacket immediately. A woman in formal legal robes waited for him at the entrance. She introduced herself as Maria Santos and explained she was the executor of General Kane's estate. Her voice was professional, but Jake could hear the sadness underneath. The general had clearly been important to many people. Inside the building was warm and decorated with artifacts from a dozen different worlds. Jake recognized some of them from battles he had fought in. There were weapons mounted on walls and flags from ships that no longer existed. It felt like walking through a museum of recent history that was still too painful to properly remember. Maria led him to a conference room where 2 other people waited. One was a young woman with dark hair who introduced herself as Lieutenant Amy Chen from Naval Intelligence. Jake had heard of her, but they had never served together. The other person was an older man named Captain Ross Turner, who had served directly under General Kane for most of the war. Maria activated a holographic display, and the image of General Kane appeared before them. The recording must have been made shortly before his death, because the general looked exhausted. His uniform was clean, but his eyes held the weight of too many hard decisions. The general's recorded voice filled the room, and Jake found himself standing straighter out of habit. General Kane thanked them for coming and apologized for the mystery surrounding this meeting. He explained that he had discovered something during the final days of the war, and it had cost him his life. He knew he would not survive to see peace, but he had made arrangements to protect what he had found. The hologram flickered, and General Kane's expression became grave. He told them about a rescue mission he had conducted personally during the last battle. A Crythian prison ship had been detected near the front lines, and intelligence suggested it held important prisoners. The general had led a small strike team to investigate. What they found changed everything. The prisoners were not human soldiers or allied aliens. They were members of a species called the Ethermore Elves, and they had been tortured for information about something the Crythians desperately wanted. Most of the prisoners were dead or dying, but the general's team managed to save one. Her name was Lyra Starweaver, and she came with a companion that defied explanation. The hologram shifted to show images that made Jake's breath catch. The woman in the pictures was unlike anything he had ever seen. She had silver hair that seemed to glow with its own light, and her skin was pale like moonlight. Her eyes were violet, and even in a still image, they seemed to look right through whoever was watching. She wore robes that were torn and stained, but still held an elegance that spoke of a culture far older than humanity. Next to her in the image was a dragon. Jake had heard stories about the Ethermore Elves and their bonded companions, but seeing one was different. The dragon was massive, with scales that shifted between deep red and bright gold depending on the angle of the light. Its eyes were intelligent and fierce, and Jake could see the protective stance it held near the elven woman. General Kane's voice continued explaining that he had hidden Lyra and her dragon on this estate after rescuing them. The Crythians had been trying to force her to reveal the location of something called the Shadow Forge. The general did not fully understand what it was, but he knew it was important enough that people would kill to possess it. The recording grew darker in tone. General Kane admitted that his death was not an accident. He had been targeted by someone who wanted access to Lyra and the secrets she held. He had made this recording as insurance and as a way to pass on the responsibility of protecting her. Then came the part that shocked Jake completely. General Kane stated that he was leaving guardianship of Lyra Starweaver and her Dragon Ember to Lieutenant Jake Morrison. The room fell silent as the hologram faded. Jake stared at the empty space where the general's image had been and tried to process what he had just heard. Amy looked surprised and Captain Turner seemed concerned but not shocked. Maria pulled up additional documents on the display. She explained that the general's instructions were clear. Jake was to take custody of Lyra and Ember and protect them from anyone who might try to capture or harm them. The general had left resources including credits and safe houses scattered across human territory. But the most important thing was the warning. General. Kane believed that elements within both the human government and the remaining Crithian forces would come looking for Lyra. She represented something valuable and dangerous, and there were people who would not hesitate to kill anyone who stood in their way. Jake finally found his voice and asked why him. He was just a soldier and not particularly high-ranking. There were plenty of officers with more experience and better connections who could protect someone important. Captain Turner answered that one. He said the general had watched Jake during the war and trusted him in a way he trusted few others. Jake had a reputation for following his conscience even when orders suggested otherwise. He was loyal but not blindly so, and that was exactly what Lyra needed. Maria added that Jake could refuse the inheritance. If he did, then custody would pass to the next person on the list. But she warned him that walking away might not keep him safe. Anyone investigating Lyra's location would eventually trace connections back to this meeting. Jake asked if he could meet her before deciding. Maria nodded and led them through a series of corridors that went deeper into the building. They passed through security doors that required biometric scans and eventually reached a section that felt different from the rest of the estate. The air here was cooler, and Jake could feel a strange energy that made the hair on his arm stand up. They entered a large chamber that had been converted into living quarters. The ceiling was high and open with skylights that showed the stars above. In the center of the room stood Lyra Starweaver and her Dragon Ember. Seeing them in person was overwhelming. Lyra was even more striking than her picture suggested. She stood with perfect posture, and her silver hair fell past her shoulders like a waterfall of starlight. Her violet eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him feel exposed. She wore simple clothing now but carried herself like royalty. Ember was coiled behind her, and the dragon's size was difficult to judge in the enclosed space. His scales reflected the light and created patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. The dragon's eyes tracked every movement the humans made, and Jake had no doubt the creature could kill them all in seconds if it chose to. Lyra spoke, and her voice was soft but clear. She asked if he was the one the general had chosen. Jake confirmed that he was and explained that he had not yet decided whether to accept the responsibility. She studied him for a long moment, then told him he should refuse. Her words were blunt and without emotion. She said that everyone who tried to protect her ended up dead, and she did not want another life on her conscience. The general had been kind, but his kindness had killed him. Jake felt something shift inside him at those words. He recognized the tone because he had used it himself. It was the voice of someone who had lost too much and was trying to protect others by pushing them away. He told her that the general must have had good reasons for his choices, and Jake owed it to the man's memory to at least hear her story. He asked what the Crithians wanted from her and what the Shadowforge was. Lyra's expression did not change, but Ember shifted slightly behind her. She said that some secrets were too dangerous to share, and knowing them would only put him in more danger. The less he knew, the safer he would be. Jake almost smiled at that. He pointed out that according to the general's warning, he was already in danger just from being at this meeting. If people were going to come after him anyway, he would rather know why. For the first time, Lyra's mask cracked slightly. Something that might have been respect flickered in her violet eyes. She told him he was either very brave or very foolish, and she had not decided which. Before Jake. The ship dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the edges of human-controlled space, and Jake felt his shoulders relax for the first time in hours. The stars here looked different than the ones near Sanctuary Prime, and that meant they had put real distance between themselves and whoever had attacked the estate. Lyra remained at the controls with her silver hair pulled back and her violet eyes scanning the navigation displays. She had not spoken much during the journey, and Jake had learned not to push. Ember was still in the cargo bay, and occasionally Jake felt the ship vibrate slightly as the Dragon shifted position. Jake checked their fuel reserves and calculated. They had enough to reach New Montana if they were careful. His family's colony was small and remote enough that most people forgot it existed. It was not the safest hideout, but it was the only place. Jake could think of where they might find temporary shelter while he figured out what to do next. He told Lyra about New Montana and explained that his sister Claire ran the family ranch there. The colony had been established 30 years ago by settlers who wanted to live far from the core worlds and their politics. Most of the colonists were farmers or miners, and they valued hard work and privacy above everything else. Lyra listened without commenting, then asked if his sister would accept her presence. Jake admitted he did not know. Claire had lost her husband during the war, and she was not fond of aliens in general. But she was also loyal to family and would not turn Jake away even if she disagreed with his choices. The journey to New Montana took another 2 days, and Jake used the time to try learning more about Lyra. She answered his questions carefully, and always seemed to be weighing how much to reveal. He learned that the Ethermore elves had been an old civilization long before humans left their home planet. They had mastered technologies that seemed like magic to other species and had focused on understanding the fundamental nature of reality itself. Lyra explained that she was a void weaver, which meant she could manipulate dark matter and perceive things that existed outside normal space and time. Her order had been small and exclusive, with only a few dozen members across the entire elven civilization. The Crithians had hunted them specifically because void weavers were the only ones who could operate something called the Shadow Forge. When Jake asked what the Shadow Forge actually was, Lyra hesitated longer than usual. Finally, she told him it was an ancient device created by her ancestors to maintain balance in the universe. She said it could see all possible futures and prevent catastrophic events that might unravel reality itself. The Crithians had discovered fragments of old prophecies suggesting humans would spread across the galaxy in an unstoppable wave, and they wanted to use the Shadow Forge to prevent that future from happening. Jake felt cold at those words. He asked if the prophecies were real, and if humans were truly destined to dominate the galaxy. Lyra said the future was not fixed, and prophecies only showed possibilities. Every choice made by every living being changed the potential outcomes. The Crithians had been foolish to think they could control fate by force. She added that General Kane had understood this, which was why he protected her. The general believed that trying to manipulate the Shadow Forge would cause more harm than letting events unfold naturally. But there were others who disagreed. Jake pressed for details about who else knew about the Shadow Forge. Lyra admitted she did not know for certain, but General Kane had warned her that some human officials had learned about the device. They saw it as the ultimate strategic weapon and wanted to secure it before any rival species could find it. The general had refused to help them, and that was likely what got him killed. The revelation troubled Jake deeply. The idea that humans might try to use such power for domination went against everything he thought the war had been about. They had fought the Crithians to survive and protect their right to exist. If human leaders were now planning to do the same thing to other species, then the war had taught them nothing. New Montana appeared on their sensors as a small blue and green world orbiting a yellow star. The colony had only one proper city, and most of the population lived in scattered settlements across the main continent. Jake guided the ship toward the northern region where his family's ranch was located. They landed in a clearing near the main house just as the local sun was setting. Jake saw Claire come out onto the porch, and even from a distance he could tell she was surprised. He had not told her he was coming because he did not want to risk communications being intercepted. Claire Morrison was 2 years older than Jake, with the same dark hair and strong build. She wore practical clothing covered in dust from a day of work, and her expression shifted from surprise to concern as Jake emerged from the ship. Then Lyra stepped out, and Claire's hand moved instinctively toward the weapon she kept on her belt. Jake quickly moved between them and held up his hands. He told Claire to wait and let him explain. His sister's eyes were hard, but she nodded once and waited. Explaining the situation took time, and Jake left out some of the more sensitive details about the Shadow Forge. He focused on the fact that General Kane had entrusted Lyra to his care, and that people were hunting her for reasons connected to the war. Claire listened without interrupting, and her expression gave away nothing. When Jake finished, Claire looked at Lyra for a long moment. Finally, she asked Lyra directly if she was dangerous to the colonists. Lyra met her gaze steadily and said she had no intention of harming anyone, but her presence might bring danger from those who pursued her. Claire appreciated the honesty. She told them they could stay in the guest house on the property, but she wanted them to keep a low profile. The colonists were still processing everything that had happened during the war, and tensions with non-humans were high. If people learned there was an alien on the ranch, it could cause problems. Jake thanked his sister and meant it sincerely. Claire's expression softened slightly, and she reminded him that family took care of family even when they made questionable decisions. Then she asked about the cargo bay, and Jake explained about Ember. Claire's reaction to seeing the dragon was worth remembering. Her jaw dropped and she took several steps backward before catching herself. Ember emerged from the ship with casual grace and stretched his wings, which spanned nearly 30 meters when fully extended. The dragon's scales caught the last light of the setting sun and created patterns that looked like flowing fire. Claire found her voice and asked Jake if he had lost his mind. Keeping a low profile would be impossible with a dragon the size of a small building living on her property. Jake admitted he had not thought that part through completely. Lyra spoke up and explained that Ember could make himself less noticeable when needed. She said something in a language Jake did not recognize, and the dragon's form seemed to shimmer. Suddenly, Ember appeared much smaller, though Jake could sense the illusion was not complete. The dragon had not actually changed size, but somehow made himself harder to perceive accurately. Claire was not entirely convinced, but agreed they could keep Ember in one of the old barns on the far side of the property. As long as the dragon stayed out of sight and did not eat any of the livestock, they could make it work temporarily. Over the following days, Jake tried to settle into a routine while planning their next moves. He contacted Amy Chen using a secure channel that General Kane had set up. Amy was relieved to hear from him and reported that Maria and Captain Turner had survived the attack on the estate. They were both in hiding now, and had shared what they knew with certain trusted contacts in naval intelligence. Amy had been digging into classified records about General Kane's final missions. What she found disturbed her greatly. The general had been investigating something called the Nexus Protocol in the weeks before his death. All official records of this protocol had been systematically erased, but Amy managed to recover fragments from backup systems. The Nexus Protocol appeared to be a secret project authorized by Admiral Helen Cross, who currently headed the Terran Security Council. The project involved locating and securing ancient alien technologies that could provide strategic advantages. The Shadowforge was listed as a priority target. Jake felt his stomach turn as Amy explained further. Admiral Cross had a reputation as a hardliner who believed humanity needed to establish dominance in the galaxy to prevent future wars. She had significant support among military and political leaders who shared her views. If Cross knew about Lyra's connection to the Shadowforge, she would stop at nothing to acquire both. Amy warned Jake that he needed to assume Cross had access to vast resources, including intelligence networks and special forces teams. Staying hidden would become increasingly difficult as Cross narrowed down their location. She advised Jake to consider moving Lyra off-world to somewhere outside the Admiral's direct reach. Jake thanked Amy for the information and promised to stay in touch. After ending the call, he found Lyra in the guest house, sitting by a window and looking out at the landscape. She seemed smaller somehow without Ember nearby, and Jake realized how much the dragon's presence defined her. He told her about his conversation with Amy and explained the threat Admiral Cross represented. Lyra listened without apparent surprise and said she had expected this. Powerful people always wanted to control. The mountains of New Montana were harsh and unforgiving in ways that reminded Jake of combat zones he had fought in during the war. The terrain was rocky and steep, with narrow passages that twisted between cliffs of dark stone. Snow covered the higher elevations even during the warm season, and the wind cut through, clothing like invisible blades. Jake led the way through. Paths he had explored as a younger man before the war had pulled him away from home. Lyra followed without complaint, even though the physical demands were clearly taking a toll on her. Ember flew overhead in wide circles and occasionally landed to rest his massive form on rocky outcroppings that seemed barely capable of supporting his weight. They had been traveling for 3 days when Jake spotted the first signs of pursuit. Scan signatures appeared on his portable tracker indicating aerial drones searching the area in grid patterns. The drones were military grade, and that meant Kira Valdez had resources that went beyond what a typical bounty hunter could access. Jake guided them into a narrow canyon where the rock walls would provide cover from aerial surveillance. Lyra moved close beside him, and her violet eyes scanned the cliffs above with obvious concern. She told him that whoever was hunting them was very good at their job and would not be fooled by simple evasion tactics for long. Jake asked how she could tell, and Lyra explained that she could sense the pattern of the search. It was methodical and patient with no wasted effort. Whoever commanded the pursuit understood how fugitives thought and was cutting off escape routes before they could be used. Ember landed nearby and folded his wings tight against his body. The dragon's scales had shifted to match the dark stone around them, making him surprisingly difficult to see despite his size. Jake wondered how many other abilities the creature possessed that he had not yet witnessed. They made camp in a cave that went deep enough to hide their heat signatures from scanners. Jake started a small fire using dried moss and dead wood, while Lyra used her abilities to create a barrier at the cave entrance that would hide the light from outside observers. The barrier looked like nothing more than shadows, but Jake could feel the energy it contained. As they ate rations from Jake's pack, Lyra finally opened up about her capture by the Crithians. She described how her order had been meeting to discuss the prophecies about humanity when Crithian forces attacked. Most of the Voidweavers were killed immediately, and only a handful were taken prisoner. The Crithians had wanted them to use the Shadowforge to alter the timeline and prevent humans from ever leaving their home world. Lyra said the torture had been systematic and cruel. The Crithians used both physical pain and mental techniques designed to break the will of their captives. One by one, the other Voidweavers died either from their injuries or from choosing death over betrayal. Lyra had been the last survivor when General Kane's team found the prison ship. Jake listened with growing anger and asked why she had not told him this before. Lyra met his eyes and said she had not wanted his pity. She was tired of being seen as a victim when she had survived through her own strength and determination. He understood that feeling better than she probably realized. Jake had his own memories from the war that he rarely shared with anyone. He told her about a battle on a planet called Nova Station, where his unit had been pinned down for 6 days. Most of his friends died during that siege, and Jake survived by luck more than skill. The guilt of living when others had not was something that never fully went away. Lyra reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The gesture was brief, but it carried weight. She said that survivors carried their own kind of burden, and it was not made lighter by others, telling them they were lucky to be alive. They sat in companionable silence for a while, before Ember made a low warning sound. Jake grabbed his weapon and moved to the cave entrance. Through the shadow barrier, he could see movement in the canyon below. A woman stood in the open looking directly at their hiding place. She was tall, with dark skin and close-cropped hair. Her clothing was practical combat gear that looked well used. She carried weapons but kept them holstered in what might have been a gesture of non-aggression. The woman called out that she knew they were in the cave and there was no point in hiding. She introduced herself as Kira Valdez and said she had been hired to bring Lyra in alive and unharmed. She proposed they talk before things escalated into violence that nobody really wanted. Jake looked at Lyra, who seemed unsurprised by this development. Lyra said that Kira had been tracking them since they left the ranch and had allowed them to think they were escaping. The bounty hunter was good enough to have caught them several times already, but had chosen to wait. Jake asked why someone that skilled would want to talk instead of just completing the mission. Lyra suggested they find out and walked toward the cave entrance before Jake could stop her. Kira watched Lyra emerge with professional assessment in her eyes. Jake followed close behind with his weapon ready but not aimed. Ember remained at the cave entrance with his bulk blocking any quick retreat. Kira said she had been hired by parties connected to Admiral Cross to retrieve Lyra Starweaver for reasons related to galactic security. She had been told that Lyra possessed information about a weapon that threatened humanity's survival. However, during her pursuit, Kira had done research of her own and discovered that the story she had been given did not match the evidence. She explained that Admiral Cross's people claimed Lyra was a Crithian collaborator who had helped to design weapons used against human forces. But Kira had found records of the prison ship rescue and General Kane's after-action reports. Those documents painted a very different picture of who Lyra was and what she represented. Jake asked what Kira wanted, if not to complete her contract. The bounty hunter said she wanted the truth because she was tired of being used as a tool by people with hidden agendas. She had fought in the war like Jake and had believed they were protecting humanity's right to exist. If Admiral Cross was lying about Lyra, then Kira needed to know why before she handed over someone who might be innocent. Lyra studied Kira for a long moment, then asked what would convince her. Kira said she wanted to understand what the Shadowforge really was and why powerful people were willing to kill to control it. So Lyra told her story again, but this time with more detail than she had shared with Jake. She explained the true nature of the Shadowforge and the role her people had played as guardians of cosmic balance. She described the prophecies about humanity and how the Crithians had tried to prevent those futures from manifesting. Then Lyra revealed something new that made both Jake and Kira go very still. She said that Admiral Cross did not just want to prevent other species from using the Shadowforge. The Admiral wanted to use it to eliminate potential rivals before they could become threats to human dominance. Cross believed that the only way to ensure lasting peace was to make humanity so powerful that no other species would dare challenge them. Kira absorbed this information with visible discomfort. She said that if what Lyra claimed was true, then Admiral Cross was planning to do exactly what the Crithians had attempted. The Admiral would be trying to manipulate fate itself, and that could have consequences nobody could predict. Lyra confirmed that the danger was real. She said that using the Shadowforge to commit genocide, even genocide that had not happened yet, would create instabilities in reality that might destroy far more than the intended targets. The device was meant to maintain balance, not to serve the ambitions of individuals or nations. Jake asked Kira what she intended to do with this information. The bounty hunter was quiet for a long time before answering. Finally, she said that her contract required her to bring Lyra in, but it did not specify a timeline. She could report that the search was ongoing while she investigated further. However, she warned that other hunters would eventually be sent, and some of them would not hesitate to use lethal force if capture proved difficult. Lyra thanked Kira for her honesty and said that choosing to question orders took courage. Kira shrugged and said she had learned during the war that following orders blindly led to atrocities. Sometimes the harder path was the right one, even if it came with consequences. Kira provided them with intelligence about Admiral Cross's operations. She explained that the Admiral had assembled a fleet under the pretext of hunting remaining Crithian holdouts. The real purpose was to locate the Shadowforge, which Cross believed was hidden somewhere on the elven homeworld of Ethermore. The planet was currently occupied by Crithian forces that refused to accept their empire's defeat. Jake realized the implications immediately. If they wanted to prevent Admiral Cross from misusing the Shadowforge, they would need to reach Ethermore first. That meant traveling to a world deep in contested space and somehow getting past both Crithian occupiers and human forces that would be searching for the same target. Lyra said that was exactly what they needed to do. The Shadowforge had to be protected, and the only way to do that was to secure it before anyone else could reach it. She admitted that returning to Ethermore terrified her, because it meant confronting the ruins of her civilization and facing the place where most of her people had died, but there was no alternative. The ruins of the ancient elven city spread before them like a graveyard of dreams. Towers that had once reached toward the sky now lay shattered across the landscape. Crystal formations that should have glowed with inner light were dark and lifeless. Lyra walked through the destruction with tears streaming down her face, but she did not slow her pace. Jake stayed close to her side while Kira covered their rear and scanned for threats. Ember flew low overhead, and his shadow passed over broken statues and collapsed buildings. The dragon made soft sounds that might have been mourning for a world he had once known. Lyra led them through streets that were choked with debris and vegetation that had reclaimed spaces once kept pristine by elven caretakers. She pointed out landmarks as they passed and shared memories of what each place had been. There was the academy where young void weavers learned to sense the fabric of reality. There was the garden where her order had gathered to meditate and share wisdom. All of it was gone now, reduced to rubble by Crithian bombardment and the passage of time without maintenance. Jake wanted to say something comforting, but words felt inadequate in the face of such loss. Instead, he simply stayed near and let his presence speak for him. They reached the base of a mountain that rose sharply from the valley floor. Lyra approached a section of rock face that looked no different from any other part of the cliff. She placed her hand against the stone and began to speak in her native language. The words had a musical quality that resonated in Jake's chest. The rock shimmered and became transparent, revealing a passageway that led deep into the mountain. Lyra stepped through without hesitation, and the others followed. Behind them, the illusion reformed and hid the entrance from any observer. The tunnel was smooth and decorated with carvings that told stories Jake could not fully understand. He saw images of elves working with cosmic energies and dragons bonded with their companions. There were scenes of the Shadow Forge being created and pictures of Voidweavers maintaining the balance of the universe. They walked for what felt like hours, descending deeper into the mountain through passages that twisted and turned. The air grew cooler and Jake began to see a faint glow ahead. The light had a quality unlike anything produced by technology, and it made his skin tingle. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber that took Jake's breath away. The space was so large that the far walls disappeared into darkness. Floating platforms hung suspended in the air, connected by bridges of pure light. At the center of the chamber was something that defied easy description. The Shadow Forge appeared as a massive structure, woven from threads of pure energy. It pulsed with colors that shifted between reality and something beyond normal perception. Looking at it made Jake's eyes hurt and his mind struggle to comprehend what he was seeing. The device seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, but they were not alone in the chamber. A small group of elves emerged from alcoves carved into the walls. They were thin and worn-looking, as if they had been surviving on minimal resources for too long. Their clothing was tattered, but they carried themselves with dignity that spoke of better times. An elderly elf stepped forward and addressed Lyra in their shared language. His voice was filled with emotion, and Jake saw Lyra embrace the old man with desperate relief. They spoke rapidly, and Jake caught occasional words that sounded like names or places. Finally, Lyra turned to Jake and Kira. She explained that these were the survivors of her order. 15 Voidweavers remained out of what had once been hundreds. They had been hiding in these sanctuaries since the Crithian invasion and protecting the Shadow Forge from discovery. The elderly elf, whose name was Theron, studied Jake and Kira with obvious suspicion. He asked Lyra why she had brought humans to this sacred place. Lyra explained about General Kane and Admiral Cross and the threat that human forces posed to the Shadow Forge. Theron's expression grew dark. He said that humans were proving to be exactly what the prophecies suggested. They were aggressive and ambitious, and they would not rest until they controlled everything within their reach. Allowing them access to the Shadow Forge would be catastrophic. Lyra argued that not all humans were the same. She told Theron about Jake's loyalty and his willingness to protect her despite the personal cost. She spoke of how Jake had questioned his own people's motives and chosen to stand against Admiral Cross even. Though it made him a fugitive, Jake felt uncomfortable being discussed as if he were not present, but he understood the elves had reason to be wary. The war had taught everyone to fear outsiders, and trust came slowly if it came at all. Kira spoke up and said that she understood their suspicion, but time was running out. Admiral Cross's fleet was in orbit and would find this place eventually. They needed to make a decision about what to do with the Shadow Forge before that happened. Theron asked what Lyra proposed. She said there was only one option that would keep the device safe from misuse. She would bond with the Shadow Forge permanently and become its eternal guardian. A Voidweaver merged with the device could prevent anyone from using it for purposes that violated the cosmic balance. Jake felt his stomach drop. He asked what that meant, and Lyra explained that bonding with the Shadow Forge required giving up everything else. She would become part of the device itself, unable to leave this chamber or live any kind of normal existence. Her consciousness would merge with the cosmic energies, and she would spend eternity maintaining the balance she had sworn to protect. He protested that there had to be another way. They could destroy the device or hide it somewhere even more remote. Lyra shook her head sadly and reminded him that destroying the Shadow Forge would cause the catastrophic failures she had described before, and hiding it would only delay the inevitable. Someone would always be searching for ultimate power. Theron said that Lyra's proposal was the traditional solution. In ancient times, a Voidweaver would volunteer to merge with the Shadow Forge when threats to its security became too great. But he warned that the process could not be reversed. Once bonded, Lyra would exist in a state between physical form and pure energy forever. Jake looked at Lyra, and saw acceptance in her violet eyes. She had known this was coming and had made her peace with it. She told him that this was why General Kane had protected her. The general understood that she might be the last Void Weaver capable of performing this duty. Before Jake could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. One of the younger elves reported that forces were breaching the outer defenses. Both Crithian troops and human marines were converging on the sanctuary from different directions. Kira cursed and checked her weapons. She said they had been tracked somehow despite all their precautions. Admiral Cross must have better intelligence resources than anyone had realized. Theron made a quick decision. He ordered the other Void Weavers to prepare the Shadow Forge for bonding. They would need time to complete the ritual and someone would have to delay the attackers. He looked at Jake and Kira meaningfully. Jake understood what was being asked. He and Kira would have to hold the entrance long enough for Lyra to complete the bonding. The odds of survival were not good, but there was no alternative. Lyra grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him aside. She told him she was sorry for dragging him into this and that he deserved better than to die defending something he barely understood. Jake stopped her and said he understood perfectly well. They were protecting the future and preventing powerful people from making choices that could destroy everything. He told her that he had grown to care about her, deeply, and that knowing she would be safe made whatever came next worthwhile. Lyra's mask finally broke completely and she embraced him tightly. She whispered that in another life they might have had time to explore what existed between them. But this life required different sacrifices. Ember approached and nudged Jake gently with his massive head. The dragon's eyes held intelligence and what might have been gratitude. Jake reached out and touched the scales that were warm despite their metallic appearance. Lyra said that Ember would remain with her during the bonding. A dragon's presence was necessary to channel the energies safely. She asked Jake to remember them both and to tell people that not all aliens were threats to be eliminated. Some were friends worth protecting. Jake promised he would and then forced himself to walk away. Kira was already setting up defensive positions near the tunnel entrance. She had placed charges along the passage that would slow attackers and create choke points. The first wave of Crithian soldiers appeared within minutes. They came in formation with heavy weapons and energy shields. Kira triggered the charges and the tunnel collapsed in sections, forcing the Crithians to advance slowly through the rubble. Jake fired carefully and made each shot count. The confined space worked in their favor because the attackers could not use their numerical advantage. But ammunition was limited and reinforcements would keep coming. Behind them, the chamber filled with light as the Void Weavers began their ritual. Lyra stood before the Shadow Forge with Ember at her side. The other elves surrounded them and began channeling energy into the device. The air itself seemed to vibrate with power. Human marines appeared from a different tunnel and Jake realized they were being flanked. Admiral Cross had sent forces through multiple. The aftermath of what happened in the sanctuary spread across the galaxy like ripples on still water. Admiral Cross returned to face judgment from the Terran Security Council, and her testimony about the Shadow Forge and the visions changed everything. Many of her supporters received pardons in exchange for cooperation in building new policies based on coexistence rather than domination. General Thax carried the message back to what remained of the Crithian Empire. His people had scattered across dozens of worlds after their defeat, and many refused to accept that the war was truly over. But Thax spoke of what he had witnessed, and slowly minds began to change. A reformation movement started among the Crithians, focused on learning from their mistakes rather than repeating them. Jake stayed on Ethermore for several weeks, helping the surviving Void Weavers establish better security and working with both human and Crithian representatives to create formal protections for the sanctuary. Theron and the other elves were initially wary of so much outside attention, but they recognized that isolation was no longer possible. Kira took charge of forming a new organization dedicated to protecting ancient sites and powerful artifacts from exploitation. She recruited people from multiple species who shared the belief that some knowledge required guardianship rather than use. The group became known as the Keepers, and within a year they had established operations across known space. Amy arrived on Ethermore to serve as the official human ambassador. She worked closely with the elven survivors to document their history and culture. Amy said that understanding where others came from was the first step toward building real trust between species. She recorded everything the Void Weavers were willing to share and made sure those records were distributed widely. Jake visited the Shadowforge chamber often during those first weeks. He would sit in silence and feel Lyra's presence within the cosmic energies. Sometimes he felt her consciousness touch his mind and share wordless emotions. She was content in her role, though he sensed she missed the physical world and the connections she had begun to form. One day Theron approached Jake with something wrapped in cloth. The elderly elf explained that they had created a gift for him. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a crystal shard that glowed with soft violet light. Theron said the crystal was linked directly to the Shadowforge and would allow Jake to maintain contact with Lyra across any distance. Jake accepted the gift with gratitude that he could barely express. That night he held the crystal and felt Lyra's presence more clearly than ever before. She showed him images of the work she was doing, maintaining the cosmic balance. He shared stories of the progress being made toward peace. Their relationship had transformed into something unique that transcended normal understanding but remained deeply real. The months passed and Jake found himself traveling the galaxy as a peace negotiator. His experience during the war and his role in protecting the Shadowforge gave him credibility with military leaders and politicians. More importantly, his willingness to listen and find common ground made him effective at bridging gaps between hostile parties. He prevented 3 potential wars in the first year alone by helping different species understand each other's perspectives. Jake would tell them about Lyra and the sacrifice she made to give everyone a chance at a better future. He would ask if they were willing to honor that sacrifice by choosing understanding over violence. Claire sent regular messages from New Montana. The ranch had become a sanctuary for refugees from various species who needed a place to recover from the war's trauma. She complained constantly about how much work it was, but Jake could hear the satisfaction in her voice. His sister had found purpose in creating a place where old enemies could learn to see each other as people. 5 years after the events at Ethermore, Jake stood on a mountaintop. On a world called Haven's Rest, the planet had been neutral territory during the war and now hosted the headquarters of the Galactic Peace Initiative. Jake had been invited to speak at the dedication ceremony for a new memorial. The memorial honored those who had died during the war from all sides. Human names were carved alongside Crithian names and the names of dozens of other species caught in the conflict. At the center was a statue depicting figures from different worlds reaching toward each other with a representation of the Shadowforge floating above them. Jake gave a short speech about the cost of peace and the courage required to trust former enemies. He spoke about General Kane and Lyra and the choices they made that allowed this moment to happen. When he finished, there was silence followed by applause from the gathered crowd that included humans, Crithians, and representatives from species Jake was still learning about. After the ceremony, General Thax approached. The Crithian had aged visibly in 5 years, but his eyes held determination. He told Jake that the Reformation movement had gained enough support to hold elections for a new government. Thax was running on a platform of reconciliation and cooperation with other species. Early polls suggested he would win. Jake congratulated him and said that the galaxy needed leaders willing to admit past mistakes and work toward better futures. Thax agreed and added that he visited the Shadowforge regularly to remind himself of what they were all working to prevent. The visions Lyra had shared stayed with him and guided his decisions. Kira arrived with news about a new site her organization had discovered. An ancient installation on a remote world contained technology that could revolutionize energy production, but also had military applications. She wanted Jake's advice on how to handle the situation. They spent an hour discussing options, and Jake realized how much he valued having people he could trust to help navigate complicated decisions. Amy contacted him later that evening with updates from Ethermore. The elven population had grown as survivors emerged from hiding places across the galaxy. Young elves were being trained in the old ways, and Theron believed their civilization might eventually recover. Amy said it would take generations, but the possibility existed, and that was what mattered. Jake asked about Lyra, and Amy said she was maintaining the Shadowforge perfectly. The device had not experienced any attempts at unauthorized access since the security protocols were established. Amy added that she sometimes felt Lyra's presence when working in the archives, and it was comforting to know she was still watching over them all. That night, Jake sat alone in his quarters and held the crystal shard. It glowed brighter as he focused on it, and he felt Lyra's consciousness reach across the distance. She showed him visions of the cosmic balance she maintained and the countless small adjustments she made to prevent reality from fraying at weak points. He shared stories of the peace they had built together. Jake told her about the memorial and about Thax's campaign and about the young elves learning their heritage. He told her that humanity was slowly learning to be better neighbors to other species, though the progress was uneven and required constant effort. Lyra's presence wrapped around his mind gently, and he felt her approval in something that might have been love. She showed him that their sacrifice had been worthwhile. The futures she monitored were trending toward cooperation more often than conflict. The visions she had shared during the bonding ceremony continued to influence leaders across the galaxy. Jake asked if she was lonely and felt her honest answer. She was isolated in ways that were difficult to explain, but Ember's essence remained with her and provided companionship. The dragon's loyalty was eternal, and together they formed a bond that transcended normal existence. She was not happy in any simple sense, but she had found peace in her purpose. He told her that he missed her physical presence, but was honored to have known her. Jake said that meeting her had changed his understanding of what was possible and had given him purpose beyond just surviving. She had taught him that the hardest choices often led to the most important outcomes. Lyra showed him something that made his breath catch. She revealed that the Shadow Forge allowed her to see his future in broad strokes. She saw him continuing the work of building peace and becoming someone that others looked to for wisdom. She saw him finding companionship and eventually settling down, though, never forgetting what they had shared. Jake was both comforted and saddened by this vision. He asked if she could see her own future and felt her amusement. She existed outside normal time now, so her future was simply an eternal present of service. But she showed him that eternity was bearable when spent protecting the people and possibilities she cared about. They remained connected through the crystal for a long time, sharing emotions and memories that needed no words. Finally, Lyra's presence withdrew gently, and Jake was left holding the glowing shard in the darkness of his quarters. The next morning, Jake received an urgent message from the Terran Security Council. A dispute between two colony worlds was threatening to escalate into violence, and they wanted him to mediate. Jake accepted the assignment and began preparing for the journey. Before departing, he visited a communications hub and sent messages to Claire, Amy, and Kira. He told them about the new assignment and asked for their support. Within hours, all three responded with offers of help and resources. Jake smiled at the realization that he had built a network of allies committed to the same goals.